The Hidden Flower. Chapter 1, Diverging Fate. He didn't mean for this to happen. In actuality, what Shen Jiayu meant to do was to live his life without any entanglements from his past life. He'd meant to cut all ties with the people in that wretched life, not get entangled even more in them. He never meant to become the most sought-after flower of the Yunhua sect. 1. Shen Jiayu was the founder and the grandmaster of the sect. Not a mere disciple to be plucked by some lord or monarch. Still, his disciples tittered as they counted on their fingers the number of peak lords and sect leaders that wanted to court their famous but reclusive Shifu. "Ah, there's also Lord Luo," exclaimed Chen Qi, his first disciple that would have, in another life, become a famous prostitute madam of the Red Lotus Pavilion. Shen Jiayu, though that is not his name now, covered his face with his hand as his disciples squealed at the thought of the handsome demon lord. He did not need this. He thought that after being thrice born, he would be able to avoid attracting unwanted attention, especially from Kang Kaiyang and especially from that one. He'd even covered his face with a veil, changed his courtesy name and even went into seclusion for years on end. And still, trouble managed to find him. Especially the one with the surname Luo. When he first woke up in the woodshed of the Qiu estate to the sound of Yuki's tapping on the door, Shen Jiayu had scrambled towards the door to peer through the hole in the wood. The sight of his Qije hole and just the way he remembered even after 2 lifetimes, made him burst into tears. In his former life as Shen Qinkyu, he had not allowed himself to cry after he had joined Kang Kaiyang, for fear of showing weakness. That is, until Luo Bing brought him a shattered Juansu to show him proof of Yu Qingyuan's death. Then, everything else had just ceased to matter. After that, he was reborn as the second child of a pair of wealthy parents who were usually absent from his life. But what he lacked in parental affection his siblings more than made up for it. He was never starving, never beaten, never abused in any way or distrusted even when he lied. It was as if fate was making up for all the pain he had gone through as Shen Qinkyu. And then, just as he approached his 30th birthday, he died. An abrupt thing that was painless and frankly, meaningless too. He'd simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time, standing at the intersection when the drunk driver drove past. Now, he found himself back in Qiu Jianluo's estate waiting for a lifetime of pain again. Was he doomed to live this life of eternal abuse again? Well, fuck that. There's no way he was going to let that happen. He was going to leave the first chance he got and be damned with the Qiu family. He'd paid that debt 1,000 times over with his former life. Qiu Haitang can have her beloved brother all she wants, future abuse and all. Coming back to the present, Shen Jiayu rubbed away his tears and spoke to the child on the opposite side of the door urgently. "Don't come back for me," he whispered to the boy on the other side. "Don't ever come back for me." "No, Zio Jiayu," Yuki exclaimed, a little too loud for comfort. "No, you listen to me," he said firmly but quietly. "Yuki, you owe me nothing so you don't need to come back for me." He shushed Yuki before he could say anything further, then continued, "You are going to become great and amazing on your own, so you must take care of yourself and don't do anything rashly. You don't need to worry about me," Shen Jiayu said, still firm in his words. "I will run away first chance I get. So you must take care of yourself and wait for me at Kang Kaiyang." "Zio Jiayu," Yuki started but was interrupted once again. "Stop," Shen Jiayu said, sniffling. "Stop being so wishy-washy. I'll be fine. I'll take care of myself. I don't need you." His words visibly hurt Yuki, especially because they both knew that the only reason why he was here was because of Yuki's soft heart. But his beloved Qije needed that boot in the ass or he would make the same mistakes again. "Qije," he said, trying to soften the blow of his words. "One day, if heaven permits, we will meet again." Yuki put his hand on the wood and Shen Jiayu did the same, thinking, please, let him listen to me this once. Let him be safe. That is all I ever wanted. All I'll ever want. "Zio Jiayu," Yuki sniffled. "I can't." "You can," Shen Jiayu said firmly. "You can and you will." Yuki shook his head, too devastated to say anything else. "Promise me you will never come back for me." That you will take care of yourself, Shen Jiayu urged. Promise me. I promise, Yuki sobbed. Shen Jiayu's heart hurt at the sound. His Kije was so soft-hearted he would never be able to survive without him. Wasn't that why Luo Bing had so easily ensnared the sect leader of Kangkaiang Mountain? We will meet again one day, he said, an empty promise that he knew he would never fulfill. Wait patiently for me at Kangkaiang. At least, now they will be even. He watched through the small hole in the door as Yuki picked himself up and disappeared behind the fence. This will be the last time I ever lay eyes on Yuki again, he told himself. I will never darken his doorway and his life again with my presence. Of course, life never really goes the way one expects. He knew he couldn't stay in Qiu residence for long. Qiu Jianluo was a bloodthirsty pervert who would grab any opportunity he could to torture Shen Jiayu. So after 3 days where Shen Jiayu hid from the young master and his cronies to steal whatever he could lay his hands on, food and treasure without being caught, he made his move to escape. His first sight of Qiu Haitang in this lifetime made him pause. He had forgotten how innocent and young she had been once. Then, the sight overlapped with a vision of his last memory of her, the hatred in her eyes, the ugly scowl-pulling lines at her face and the way her fingers had curled into claws as she spat at him. No, she can have her brother all she wants. Shen Jiayu owed nothing to her this lifetime, he decided, turning around to hide elsewhere from Qiu Jianluo. He will not seek shelter with her so he will not be beholden to her again. Fortunately for him, it seemed that Qiu Jianluo was a little too busy with his sister this time around to bother with him. Previously, Qiu Haitang had pestered her brother for something or another until he shoved Shen Jiayu at her to keep her occupied. This time, with Shen Jiayu visibly missing from action, he had to cater to his sister's every whim. In this way, Shen Jiayu managed to get away with another day from the poisonous siblings. That night, when Shen Jiayu was sure that every breath in the household had evened, a sure sign that they had fallen asleep, he broke the lock on the door of the woodshed with a small, controlled, burst of ki. He had tested his skill as much as he could without draining his ki for 2 days before he was fairly confident that he could do so without causing too much commotion. His golden core was almost non-existent, but Shen Jiayu had always had the potential to be great when he was young. His late start and Wu Yanzi were the cause of his unstable cultivation his first life as Shen Qingqiu. In his previous life as the second young master in a modern world without magic, all that knowledge had been useless to him. But now, with all the foreknowledge and wisdom of his previous life, he knew that as long as he could get away from the Qiu household, he would be able to cultivate on his own elsewhere. And he means to do exactly that. He did not meet anyone that night as he fled the abusive household that would have been the bane of his very existence if he had stayed a day more. But before he left the woodshed, he made sure to spark a small fire amidst the firewood to cover his tracks. By the time he stepped out of the city, the little woodshed would be nothing but an inferno. The Qiu family would never notice that there was no body to be found. The fire had been so bad that there was hardly anything left after the blaze had consumed everything. To this rich little family, the loss of an insignificant little slave was nothing. As far as they were concerned, the slave called Shen Jiayu was no more. Years later, a handsome young cultivator from Kangkaiang would visit to look for his long-lost Xiao Jiayu, only to be told that there was no one with that name in the household. He'd done as Xiao Jiayu had instructed. He'd cultivated, patiently, waiting for his Xiao Jiayu to join him at the sect. In this lifetime, Yuki was able to cultivate safely, unburdened by his impatience and his desire to save his childhood friend. In this lifetime, his soul was not bound to Juansu in a desperate attempt to save him. In this lifetime, he did not have a life-threatening key deviation and he would not be plagued by the knowledge that he has failed his Xiao Jiayu. Except, Shen Jiayu never joined him in Kangkaiang. So, years after he ran away, Yuki, now christened as Yukinguan, the first disciple of Kaiang Dingpeak, returned in search of his Xiao Jiayu. Unfortunately, Yukinguan would leave empty-handed, devastated by the news of his missing possibly dead childhood friend. So much so that he never noticed the young lady of the house signaling for help from him. He never noticed the desperate looks the young woman was shooting him as he turned to leave. But her brother did. As soon as Yu Qingyuan stepped out of the threshold of their home, Qiu Jianluo grabbed his sister and dragged her by her arm to his room, her slave-turned-husband, who was not Shen Jiayu in this lifetime, turning away from her cries for help. He could barely keep himself safe. How could he do anything for her? He could run after the cultivator in black, but why would he do that? When she had turned a blind eye to the suffering of all the slaves in the household for years. No, best to leave the incestuous siblings be. And farther in the future, a certain demon lord would arrive at the town that once housed the Qiu residents, only to find it a burnt husk. When he questioned the locals, he was told that the young lady of the house went insane one night and murdered almost everyone in the house. Then, she proceeded to burn the house with herself in it. So tragic, commented a stall keeper. One of the chefs who didn't live in the residence revealed after the fire that her brother and father abused the young lady daily. The chef couldn't say anything then because they threatened all the staff and their families, so she kept quiet like the others. Disgusting pigs, spat another. She was a sweet girl. A bit naive and spoiled when she was younger, but after she got married, she just changed. She got married? Inquired the demon lord who was masquerading as a human. What is her husband's name? I can't remember. I think his name was Lu? I think it was Shi Wu, or something, said the stall keeper. Not Shen Jiayu? Asked the demon lord Luo Bing. The two locals looked at each other, confused. Never heard of that name before, admitted the stall keeper. No. Both locals shook their heads and Luo Bing thought to himself that perhaps he had come to the wrong world. Perhaps, this was a world where his Shizen never existed. When Luo Bing had woken up in his youthful body years in the past, he thought that perhaps this was his chance to finally have what he always wanted, a kindly Shen Qingqiu who loved him the way he deserved. He'd spent the years as a child absolutely relishing the presence of his adoptive human mother before she died. This time, Luo Bing did not hesitate in taking and fighting for what he wanted. He made sure that their lives were a little better than his last lifetime by providing his mother with what little money that he could make by fighting and doing heavy lifting. His body may be small, but he'd learned early on how to push himself physically to strengthen himself. Even sealed, he was still half demon. He vowed that when the time came for him to break his seal in his adolescence, he would find Mobi-jun to do it for him. And he did. But before then, after his mother's death, he had headed to Kangqiang, promising himself that he would see his Shizen soon and that he would make Shen Qingqiu love him like the one the crybaby version of himself married did. Except, Shen Qingqiu wasn't there at Kangqiang. Instead, it was some subpar, arrogant man with a horrendous goatee that was the Qingjing Peak Lord. This time, Luo Bing was chosen as a disciple by the Bei's Han Peak Lord, Lu Qingj, one of his previous wife's brother. Life in Bei's Han Peak was not any better. The bullying was actually worse, physically at least. His elder martial brothers took any opportunity to beat him up, calling it training. His Shizen was not any better, leaving for hunts whenever he wanted and returning only to discipline aka beat up his disciples. He usually left everything to his senior disciples and hall masters, completely unconcerned about the management of his peak. For Luo Bing, who was more of a physical cultivator than a scholarly one, he thrived after the initial months of being beaten up. It didn't take long at all for him to come up on top amongst the disciples and for Lu Qingj to appoint him as head disciple. Still, he couldn't forget his real Shizen, the one that shaped him for who he was in his first life. So, soon after forming his golden core, he left Kangqiang on the pretense of going on a journey to hunt beasts and strengthen himself. Instead, he went in search of Mobi-jun first. It took him some time to convince the other demon lord to help him unseal his limitations and longer still to actually conquer the demon world. When he was firmly enthroned again in the demon world, he was finally able to track down the Qiu family, in which Shen Jiayu belonged to as a slave before he massacred everyone there in Luo Bing's first life. Only, he wasn't there. Was never there? It was as if Shen Jiayu never existed. and Qiu Haitang burned herself to death after taking his place as the target of sexual abuse from her father and brother. Luo Bing didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His second chance at proving himself worthy to his Shizan was all for naught. Shizan, you have your revenge on us just by not being here. The thing was, Luo Bing didn't realize yet that he'd already met Shen Qingqiu. He just wasn't using that name anymore.